Welcome back to the Auburn Avenue podcast. We're here again with Peter Leithart, who was here to give 4 lectures on postmodernism for our Dabney Center. And again, Peter, I want to follow up on some of the things we were talking about in regard to postmodernism. What do you see as you look into your crystal ball? What do you think is the legacy of postmodernism? How is it going to affect us in the days ahead, months, years ahead?
Well, at that point, I want to distinguish between different things that we mean by postmodernism, because I think that the answer to the question, from what we can see at this point, the answer to the question depends on what sector we're talking about. If you're talking about the intellectual movements of postmodernism, people like Derrida and Foucault, and others of that sort, I think that there's some important intellectual moves made there that will probably become part of the Western tradition of philosophy, Western tradition of intellectual history. I think that there's probably there's a less dramatic break there, and in 100 years, people will be reading. Philosophy anthologies already include essays by Derrida alongside essays by Kant and Descartes and Aquinas and so forth. He's part of the Western tradition of philosophy. So I think that they'll have their place, but I don't see that as necessarily a major break. As far as pop postmodernism, I think that in large measures feels to me like more of a fad that is probably not something that's going to persist over the long haul. I can imagine a swing back in another direction, more into some kind of more traditionalist direction. You see that in some cases already. There's a tradition as a kind of as something that, in some ways, is a new fad, embrace of certain certain traditional forms of life and practice and so forth. Where I think that there's a more significant shift is when we look at we think of postmodernism more institutionally and structurally, and here I think we're living at a time where there are, and I'm thinking about 100 years on either side of our own moment. I think we're living at a time where there's a significant shift in the structures of Western society and the geopolitical arrangement of the world. 1989 to 92 is, I think, certainly a century-making shift when you have the end of a bipolar geopolitical world into something that really is unipolar. I mean, America is far and away the unchallenged power and looks to be for quite a ways to come. And beyond that, you have, if thinking just still in political terms, you're looking at various forces, technological forces, economic forces that have undermined some of the centrality of the nation state, which has been the modern form of political organization predominantly. And so when you look at those kind of major changes, I think there are economic shifts as well. That you look at those kind of structural changes, it does look to me like we're in a transitional period, moving into some other kind of order. We really are moving out of the modern arrangement of things into or the modern arrangement of nations and empires into something else. And I think at that point, the idea of a postmodern age becomes more plausible. When you're looking at fashions and trends, it's harder to say that this really is something new and it's going to last. But when you're looking at something that's more fundamental structure of how the political world is organized, that seems to be more long-lasting.
Let me get to some of the questions that have been turned in by some of our students that were here today. And I think you can also email questions to us if you'd like, not for Peter Leithart, he's not going to be here, but questions you'd like to see addressed. You can mail it to inmediasrace@auburnavenue.org. Okay, let me get to the questions now. The doctrine of the Trinity occupies a large place in your theology. Why do you think it's so important to emphasize this in soteriology and ecclesiology?
Well, I certainly wouldn't limit it to that. I think the doctrine of the Trinity needs to be emphasized in theology proper, in a way that it hasn't been in a lot of the, not just Reformed tradition, but a lot of the Western tradition. Karl Rahner, Roman Catholic theologian from the last century, talks about a key shift in the Middle Ages from the time of Peter Lombard to the time of Aquinas. Lombard, when he writes about God, writes a treatise on the triune God. By the time you get to Aquinas, Aquinas has a treatise on the one God, and then a treatise on the triune God. So Aquinas describes the attributes of God, he describes the existence of God. He goes through a whole series of questions about theology proper before you know that he's talking about a triune God, whereas Lombard only talks about God as Father, Son, and Spirit. That could be just a pedagogical change and not really significant, but I think that at least symbolizes an important shift in the way that people, the way that theologians have done theology proper since the High Middle Ages, which is, I mean, all the Reformed dogmatics texts from all of them, as far as I know, do the same thing. They have a discussion of the attributes of God and the nature of God separated from the doctrine of the Trinity. And I think knowing that the attributes of God are attributes of a triune God is essential to understanding the nature of those attributes, and to even talk about God having attributes, I think, requires an understanding of the triunity of God. So that's just to say I wouldn't say that it's only in soteriology or ecclesiology that we need to emphasize the Trinity. I think it's across the board that it's been neglected, and that would be part of my rationale for saying that it needs to be foundational to soteriology and ecclesiology, is that it has been neglected. There's some time between the Reformation and the end of the 17th century, the doctrine of the Trinity became marginalized in at least English-speaking theology. And if the God who saves us is the triune God, and if the God to whom we're united as the body of Christ is the triune God, then that has to affect the way we think about the church and the way we think about salvation, the way we think about human nature. We're created in the image of a triune God, so that has to make some difference about the way we understand what our humanity is about.
Yeah, one of the things you brought up today in the lectures was this whole idea about how the self is conceived and problems with that.
Right.
How does the Trinity help us out there?
Yeah, that's a great example, because I think the problems of the self and understanding the self arise in part because relationality is not seen as essential to the self. You define who a person is, what a self is, what a human being is, in isolation from the relation to God, relation to other people, relation to the world. If God is triune, though, then God himself is not defined apart. He's defined in terms of that relationality. The Father is not the Father except as he is the Father of the Son. And to say that he's the Father is to describe that's who he is, that's his identity, that's his being. That's not something added to some underlying non-paternal divine nature. He is God as Father, the Son is God as Son. Those are relational terms. So if God is triune, God is inherently a community, then when he creates human beings, he creates human beings to be in relation to him, relation to one another, relation to the world. That's part of the definition of human character. But I should say, going back to your earlier question, I think that part of the issue is simply exegetical, and I think when I've tried to emphasize the doctrine of the Trinity, I've tried to avoid the tendency to speculate, which is something that has plagued the Christian tradition about the Trinity, and the Trinity understood in separation from the economy of redemption. When we talk about ecclesiology, for example, why do we want to introduce the Trinity into the doctrine of the church? Well, Jesus' prayer about the unity of the church is a prayer that assumes the relation of the Father and the Son is the paradigm of the relation of members of the church. In John 17, Jesus says that, talks about his oneness with the Father is in him, he is in the Father, and then he goes on to pray that they may be one even as we are one. So that just in terms of sheer exegetical weight, Jesus is saying that the unity of the church is a mirror of the unity of the persons of the Trinity.
Thank you.